The winter storms of Boston possess a uniquely vicious, unforgiving nature. They come tearing off the freezing Atlantic Ocean, whipping jagged sleet and howling winds against the historic brick facades of the city. But as I sat in the penthouse boardroom of the Caldwell Heritage Hotel, listening to the thick floor-to-ceiling glass rattle under the storm's absolute fury, I realized a terrifying truth. The biting, sub-zero temperature outside was absolutely nothing compared to the suffocating. The winter storms of Boston possess a uniquely vicious, unforgiving nature. They come tearing off the freezing Atlantic Ocean, whipping jagged sleet and howling winds against the historic brick facades of the city. But as I sat in the penthouse boardroom of the Caldwell Heritage Hotel, listening to the thick floor-to-ceiling glass rattle under the storm's absolute fury, I realized a terrifying truth. The biting, sub-zero temperature outside was absolutely nothing compared to the suffocating, calculated cruelty actively freezing the air inside this room. We had spent our nights on our hands and knees, scrubbing porcelain toilets until our knuckles bled, skipping meals to pay the heating bills, and sacrificing every ounce of our fleeting youth to build a legacy. Now the heavy, opulent scent of lemon polish, old money, and imported leather hung in the air. But the sanctuary I built had been thoroughly breached. The vultures had finally arrived, wearing designer suits and carrying legal briefcases. The very people I had bled to provide for were currently circling above my head, eagerly waiting to pick my old bones completely clean. My daughter-in-law, Isabella, stood looming over me. She did not look like a woman deeply concerned for her aging, widowed mother-in-law's fragile health. Dressed in a razor-sharp, blood-red designer suit that probably cost more than my first hotel's monthly mortgage, she looked exactly like an apex predator who had finally cornered her wounded, exhausted prey. Her stiletto heels clicked against the imported Italian marble floor, a sharp, rhythmic, agonizing ticking that sounded like a metronome counting down to my absolute execution. Agonizing ticking that sounded like a metronome counting down to my absolute execution. "It is over, Eleanor," Isabella said, her voice dropping into a sickening, highly rehearsed register that mixed fake, sugary pity with raw, venomous arrogance. She leaned forward, placing both of her flawlessly manicured hands flat on the table, trapping me in my chair. The heavy, overpowering scent of her expensive French perfume washed over me, making my stomach physically churn with disgust. "The private doctors have made it perfectly clear. Your mind is rapidly deteriorating. You are slipping away from us day by pathetic day." I looked up at her, keeping my expression perfectly blank, forcing my hands to rest limply in my lap. I was applying a psychological technique I had mastered decades ago in the ruthless corporate world. Total containment. I let the spring inside my chest compress, taking the abuse, fueling the fire. "You forgot my name twice last week," Isabella continued, her voice rising in theatrical volume for the benefit of the silent executives lining the walls. "You dropped your antique tea tray in the parlor, shattering priceless family heirlooms because your hands simply wouldn't stop shaking. You wandered into the grand lobby yesterday looking for Richard. Richard has been dead for 30 years, Eleanor. You are practically a ghost wandering these halls, holding onto a crown you no longer have the mental capacity to wear." She paused, letting the brutal, suffocating humiliation of her lies sink into the stagnant air. She was gaslighting me with the surgical precision of a seasoned psychopath. The dropped tea tray, the momentary lapses in memory, they were carefully orchestrated, entirely fabricated moments of weakness I had intentionally spoon-fed to her to test her loyalty. But she believed them entirely. She thought my brilliant mind was rotting from the inside out. "Sign the company over to Leo," Isabella commanded, pointing a long, sharp fingernail at the documents. "Let us put you in a comfortable, high-end psychiatric care facility in Vermont where you can finally rest. You will be locked away safely, you will be looked after by professionals, and the Caldwell legacy will be protected from your incompetence." Protected from my incompetence. The sheer, unadulterated audacity of that statement sent a shockwave of cold fury straight through my core. I slowly turned my heavy, supposedly tired eyes to my biological son, Arthur Jr. He was sitting directly to Isabella's right, slouched deep into his custom-tailored, dark navy Italian suit. I had paid for that suit. I had paid for his elite Ivy League education. I had paid the down payment on the multi-million-dollar Beacon Hill estate he currently lived in. Yet here he was, staring intensely at his expensive, polished Oxfords, his pale face slick with a cowardly, nervous sweat. He was 35 years old. He was a grown man, a supposed heir to an empire, yet he couldn't even summon the basic human courage to lift his chin and meet his mother's eyes while his wife actively stripped away my freedom, my dignity, and my life's work. He was watching them prepare my coffin, and he was holding the nails. "Arthur?" I whispered. I deliberately let my voice crack, pitching it higher, making myself sound frail, profoundly confused, and utterly terrified. I let my lower lip tremble just a fraction of an inch, perfectly mimicking the devastating effects of the dementia they accused me of having. "Arthur, please, my boy, are you really going to sit there and let her do this to me? I am your mother. I built this entire world for you. Please don't let them take me away." Arthur flinched violently, exactly as if I had reached across the wide mahogany table and struck him across the face with a riding crop. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing sharply against his tight collar, but he kept his eyes desperately, pathetically glued to the floor. It's for your own good, Mother," he stammered, his voice weak, high-pitched, and trembling with cowardice. "You're sick. You're not yourself anymore. We just want to protect the family. Isabella is right. It's time for you to let go before you ruin everything we have." My heart, which had been beating with a slow, measured rhythm, suddenly turned into a solid block of absolute ice inside my chest. This was my flesh and blood. This was the boy I had cradled when his father passed away. The boy I had sworn on my life to protect against the entire world. And he was selling me out for a life of lazy luxury, completely willing to lock his own mother in an insane asylum just to secure his unearned inheritance. The betrayal was a physical ache, a dagger twisting slowly in my ribs. Standing in the far, shadowed corner of the grand boardroom, leaning casually against the massive mahogany bookshelf, was Julian. He was my chief operating officer, a man I had personally mentored, promoted, and trusted with the keys to the kingdom. He offered me a smug, deeply victorious smirk, subtly adjusting his expensive silk tie. I watched his eyes dart toward Isabella. It was a micro-expression, a fleeting glance of shared, intimate triumph that spoke volumes of their hidden, treacherous alliance. They thought they were absolute geniuses. They thought they had perfectly executed the ultimate corporate and familial coup. Isabella shoved a heavy gold Mont Blanc pen across the table. The expensive metal rolled smoothly over the polished wood, clinking softly against the saucer of my bone china teacup. "Sign it, Eleanor," she demanded. The fake, sugary sweetness was entirely gone now. The mask had completely slipped, leaving only the cold, hard, merciless demand of a common thief. "Don't make this any more pathetic than it already is. If you fight this, we will drag you into open court. We will parade your medical records, declare you mentally incompetent in front of the entire Boston press, and take the company anyway. Save yourself the final public humiliation and just sign the damn paper." I looked down at the gleaming gold pen. I reached out with a deliberately, violently trembling hand. I let my fingers hover over the cold metal. I let my breathing become shallow, ragged, and panicked. I gave them exactly what they had spent months trying to manufacture: a defeated, broken, senile old widow who had finally surrendered to the crushing weight of her own fading mind. I let the silence stretch. I let their arrogant smirks widen. I let the spring inside my chest compress until it felt like a nuclear bomb waiting for a spark. But beneath my gray hair, beneath my pearls and my tailored Chanel suit, my mind was not shattered. It was terrifyingly, brutally sharp. A widow might be left alone in this cold world, but a woman who builds an empire from nothing never, ever forgets how to defend her crown. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I didn't beg. I simply stopped my hand from trembling. The fake tremor vanished instantly, replaced by the absolute rock-solid stability of a seasoned corporate predator. I smoothly pulled my hand back from the pen, completely ignoring the conservatorship documents. Instead, I picked up my teacup with perfect, elegant grace, my wrist steady as steel, and took a slow, deliberate sip of my Earl Grey tea. The sudden, jarring shift in my demeanor, the instantaneous transformation from a crumbling victim to an immovable force, sent a microscopic ripple of profound confusion across Isabella's arrogant face. Her smirk faltered. Arthur looked up, his brow furrowing in sudden, creeping dread. Exactly 3 seconds later, the heavy, soundproof double doors of the boardroom violently swung open. My personal attorney, Victor Lang, a ruthless legal shark known for completely dismantling corporate giants without a shred of mercy, strode into the room. He was not alone. Flanking him were 2 towering, stone-faced federal agents wearing dark windbreakers with the golden letters FBI printed boldly across their backs. Victor didn't offer a single polite greeting. He completely ignored the gasps of shock from my cowardly son and the sudden panicked stiffening of my COO in the corner. He marched straight past Isabella, reached into his sleek leather briefcase, and pulled out a thick, certified, tamper-proof medical envelope. With a sharp flick of his wrist, he slammed the DNA test results directly on top of Isabella's conservatorship papers. Before I tell you exactly what scientific, biological impossibility was printed inside that envelope, and how I systematically, mercilessly burned their stolen, deceptive world straight to the ground, let me take you back to exactly 3 days ago. To the precise moment, a simple teacup shattered on the floor, and I realized I was sleeping in a den of vipers. 3 days ago, the sky over Boston was an unforgiving, bruised purple, heavy with the undeniable promise of a freezing, torrential downpour. The atmospheric pressure dropping rapidly outside my Beacon Hill estate perfectly mirrored the suffocating, unbearable heaviness that was actively settling inside my own chest. I was sitting in the private glass conservatory of my home, surrounded by my late husband's prized collection of rare, exotic orchids. The air in the room was climate-controlled, warm, and artificially humid, carrying the sweet, earthy scent of damp soil and blooming petals. Yet sitting in my plush velvet armchair, wrapped in a cashmere shawl, I felt completely, utterly frozen to the bone. I had just been discharged from Massachusetts General Hospital the previous afternoon following a transient ischemic attack, a mini-stroke, as the premier neurologists called it. It was a fleeting, microscopic glitch in my blood pressure, a brief moment of dizziness that had lasted less than 2 minutes while I was reviewing quarterly reports. The top doctors in the city had run every conceivable scan. They had assured me, unequivocally, that my brain was completely flawless. My cognitive faculties were just as sharp as the razor edge of a freshly cut diamond. But as I sat in the conservatory, pouring myself a cup of Earl Grey from an antique Royal Doulton silver tea service, I realized a horrifying truth. My family did not look at me and see a temporary physical weakness to be nurtured. They looked at me and saw a monumental, once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to be ruthlessly exploited. Arthur Jr., Isabella, and Julian, my supposedly loyal chief operating officer, had insisted on checking in on me that morning. They sat opposite my chair on the long emerald green velvet sofa, forming a unified, suffocating wall of judgment. I looked at my biological son, Arthur. He was casually swirling a glass of expensive, 20-year-aged bourbon. It was barely 10 o'clock in the morning. When Richard died 30 years ago, Arthur was only 5 years old. In my desperate, blinding grief, I had overcompensated. I wanted to shield my only child from the brutal, exhausting, bone-crushing struggle of building the Caldwell Empire. I gave him the softest feather beds, the finest European tutors, and an endless, invisible safety net woven from immense, limitless wealth. I thought I was protecting him, but looking at his soft, uncalloused hands, his weak, evasive eyes, and his utter lack of ambition, I realized the horrifying truth of my maternal devotion. My endless coddling had not forged a king capable of defending a castle. It had merely bred a weak, compliant parasite. And then there was Isabella. When Arthur first brought her home 15 years ago, she was a fiercely ambitious girl from a deeply unremarkable, lower-middle-class suburb. She was desperate to escape her mundane life, and she possessed a hunger I initially mistook for drive. I welcomed her with open arms. I paid for her elocution lessons, I introduced her to the notoriously exclusive Boston high society, and I essentially bought her a permanent seat among the city's elite. I gave her the world on a silver platter, and in return, she had slowly, methodically wrapped her perfectly manicured fingers around my son's throat, turning him into a silent, obedient puppet, completely subservient to her insatiable greed. I picked up my delicate bone china teacup. The warm porcelain rested against my palms. As I lifted it toward my lips, a sudden, dark, and terrifying thought crossed my fiercely calculating mind. If they truly believe I am vulnerable right now, how far will they go? I decided, in that exact second, to test the treacherous waters. I deliberately let the muscles in my right wrist go entirely limp. The delicate porcelain slipped from my fingers. It hit the polished marble floor with a sharp, violent, shattering crash that echoed loudly through the glass walls of the conservatory. The cup broke into a dozen jagged, irreparable pieces. The hot, dark tea splattered violently across the pristine, white Persian rug. I gasped softly, immediately pressing a trembling hand to my mouth, playing the part of a startled, fragile, embarrassed old woman to absolute perfection. Oh dear, my hands. I don't know what happened. I'm so clumsy today. I waited for the natural human reaction. I waited for my only son to rush forward, to anxiously ask if the boiling water had burned my legs, to gently kneel and help his aging mother clean up the sudden mess. Nobody moved a single inch. A heavy, oppressive, deeply toxic silence fell over the humid conservatory. Arthur simply stared down at the broken porcelain, his face entirely blank, taking a slow, steady sip of his morning bourbon. Julian leaned back against the plush sofa cushions, an unreadable, highly calculating smirk playing on his thin lips as he watched me. It was Isabella who finally broke the stagnant silence. She let out a long, highly exaggerated sigh of profound exhaustion, violently rolling her eyes as if she were dealing with a stubborn, unruly, and incredibly irritating toddler. "Again, Eleanor?" Isabella said. Her voice dripped with a sickening, artificial patience that completely failed to mask her underlying malice. She didn't call me mother. She hadn't bothered to use that title for months. "This is the third time this week you've broken something of value. You are becoming a serious hazard to yourself." "The third time?" I whispered, allowing genuine confusion to mask my intensely calculating mind. I looked at her with wide, bewildered eyes. "Isabella, dear, I haven't broken anything else. I've only just returned from the hospital." "Mother, please stop," Arthur chimed in. His voice was whiny, nasal, and deeply patronizing. He absolutely refused to look me in the eye, staring instead at a blooming orchid to his left. "Don't do this. Don't make us play pretend. You threw a crystal water glass at the maid 2 days ago. You were screaming hysterically that she was a spy trying to poison your food. You honestly don't remember?" My breath hitched, catching painfully in my throat. The sheer, audacious, breathtaking cruelty of the lie hit me like a physical blow to the stomach. 2 days ago, before my hospital visit, I had been reading quietly by the fireplace in my library. I had never, in 30 years of business, raised my voice at my domestic staff. He was actively, effortlessly rewriting my reality right to my face. This was textbook gaslighting, a meticulous, highly coordinated psychological assault designed to make me question my own fundamental sanity. "Arthur, I did no such thing," I stuttered. I didn't need to fake the tremor in my voice. The sheer audacity of their betrayal provided it naturally. I forced my hands to shake visibly in my lap, leaning back as if physically shrinking from their verbal blows. "I would never scream at Maria. I don't—" "It's the cognitive decline, Eleanor," Isabella interrupted smoothly, casually crossing her elegant legs. She spoke about me in the third person, as if I wasn't even sitting 3 feet away from her, as if I were a defective, broken piece of furniture that needed to be discarded. Dr. Evans explicitly warned us about these aggressive dementia outbursts. It's the permanent brain damage from the stroke. You are actively hallucinating. You are forgetting basic facts. Just yesterday, Julian had to physically step in and stop you from authorizing a catastrophic double payment to the European architectural contractors. You were completely disoriented. You didn't even know what year it was. I slowly shifted my gaze to Julian. "Julian, the brilliant young executive I had personally mentored, the man whose entire lucrative career I had built from the ground up, trusting him to manage the lifeblood of my empire. "It's absolutely true, Eleanor," Julian said, his voice a low, soothing baritone that masked a lethal, unforgiving poison. He opened his sleek leather folio and pulled out a thick stack of printed documents. I caught the financial error just in the nick of time. The shareholders would have crucified us. Because of your delicate, deteriorating state, I've taken the initiative. I had the IT department temporarily suspend your biometric access to the executive financial servers and the shadow ledgers. It's strictly a precautionary measure, Eleanor, just to protect the company's assets from your unfortunate memory lapses. The psychological spring inside my chest compressed so tightly, so violently, I thought my ribs would physically snap under the immense pressure. They were locking me out of my own company. Julian wasn't protecting the corporate assets. He was building a massive digital fortress to hide something horrific. And they were collectively using my brief, harmless hospitalization as the perfect, unquestionable, legally defensible excuse to execute their coup. They were systematically stripping me of my corporate authority, my personal dignity, and my grip on reality, burying me alive under a mountain of fabricated dementia. I wanted to stand up. I wanted to scream until my lungs bled. I wanted to grab Julian by his expensive silk tie, drag him across the Persian rug, and throw him through the thick glass walls of the conservatory. The ruthless, bloodthirsty businesswoman who had mercilessly crushed rival hotel chains in the gritty 1980s screamed at me from the depths of my soul to tear them all to bloody pieces right then and there. But I am a creature of absolute strategy. If I reacted with the explosive anger burning inside me, I would give them exactly what they needed. I would provide the physical proof to validate Isabella's lie about my aggressive dementia outbursts. I would hand them the legal ammunition required to lock me in a psychiatric ward before the sun went down. So I did the hardest thing I have ever done in my entire 65 years on this earth. I swallowed my pride. I buried my absolute apocalyptic fury deep within the darkest vault of my soul, and I played the pathetic victim they so desperately needed me to be. I let my shoulders slump heavily forward, collapsing inward as if the gravity of the room was crushing me. I stared blankly at the broken porcelain and the ruined rug on the floor. I allowed a single, genuine tear of profound, heartbreaking betrayal to slip down my wrinkled cheek. "I didn't know," I whispered. My voice was a hollow, defeated, raspy shell. I didn't realize I was getting this bad. My mind, it feels so foggy. The servers... Yes, Julian, you are right. You should handle the ledgers. Keep the company safe for Arthur. Isabella smiled. It was a terrifying, predatory expression of pure, unadulterated, intoxicating triumph. She had won. The invincible old queen was finally broken, submitting to her new master. "Don't worry your fragile, tired little head about the business anymore, Eleanor," Isabella cooed, standing up and walking slowly over to my chair. She didn't kneel to help me pick up the broken cup. Instead, she placed a cold, heavily ringed hand on my shoulder, her sharp, manicured fingers digging slightly, painfully into my collarbone. A subtle, deeply physical assertion of her newfound dominance. "Arthur and I will take over the heavy legal burden. We have already contacted the lawyers to draft a medical conservatorship agreement. We will transfer the executive voting rights to Leo, and we will manage the vast estate for him until he comes of age. You just need to sit here, rest your broken mind, and fade quietly into the background where you belong." Fade quietly into the background. I kept my head bowed, my eyes fixed firmly on the dark tea soaking into the white fibers of the rug. My silence was not an act of surrender. It was the quiet, deadly, absolute stillness of an apex predator patiently waiting for the perfect moment to strike its prey's throat. I was meticulously memorizing their arrogance. I was logging every insult, every fabricated lie, and every patronizing smirk into a mental vault that I would soon open to fund their destruction. "I am so very tired," I mumbled weakly, my hands trembling violently in my lap. "Please, I just want to be left alone now." "Of course, Mother," Arthur said quickly, already standing up, smoothing his suit jacket, eager to escape the uncomfortable, depressing presence of the woman he was actively destroying. "We'll let you rest." They turned to leave, entirely convinced of their absolute, flawless victory. But just as Julian reached for the heavy brass handle of the conservatory doors, the sharp, frantic, blaring ring of my private emergency landline shattered the oppressive, triumphant silence of the room. It was a dedicated red phone line resting on my side table. Very, very few people possessed that number. I reached over with a violently trembling hand and picked up the heavy receiver. "Hello? Mrs. Eleanor Caldwell?" a woman's voice asked. Her tone was strictly professional, clipped, but carried an undeniable, terrifying weight of extreme urgency. "This is the Emergency Trauma Center at Massachusetts General Hospital. I am calling regarding your grandson, Leo Caldwell. He has been in a severe, high-speed automobile accident on the interstate. He is currently in critical condition, and we need his immediate family here right now." I slowly lowered the phone to the cradle. The fabricated drama of my failing mind instantly evaporated, completely replaced by the cold, hard, adrenaline-fueled shock of a genuine tragedy. I looked up at Isabella and Arthur, the mask of the senile, broken old woman slipping from my face for just a fraction of a second. "It's the hospital," I said, my voice suddenly ringing out, entirely devoid of any tremor or weakness. "Leo has crashed his car. He is dying." The brutal game of corporate thrones was abruptly, violently put on hold. But neither they nor I had any idea that the impending medical emergency at the hospital wouldn't just save Leo's life. It was about to expose a 19-year-old biological secret so utterly devastating, it would blow their entire criminal conspiracy completely wide open. The frantic, terrifying drive to Massachusetts General Hospital was a chaotic, high-speed blur of flashing emergency sirens, blaring horns, and reckless swerves through the freezing, torrential Boston rain. I sat rigidly in the back of my chauffeured Maybach, my trembling hands gripping the cold leather armrest until my knuckles turned completely white. Despite the vicious, cold-blooded corporate war currently raging within my family, Leo was still my grandson. He was a reckless, heavily entitled 18-year-old boy with far too much money and far too little sense. But I had loved him unconditionally since the very moment he was born. When we finally burst through the heavy sliding glass doors of the VIP emergency trauma ward, the harsh, flickering fluorescent lights immediately stung my tired eyes. The overwhelming, sickening smell of cheap industrial bleach, rubbing alcohol, and stale waiting room coffee hung heavily in the chilly, sterile air. I spotted them immediately at the far end of the long corridor. Isabella was pacing back and forth, her expensive stiletto heels clicking a sharp, rhythmic, and highly irritated tempo against the polished linoleum floor. She was furiously typing on her smartphone, her face illuminated by the cold blue light of the screen. She did not look like a devastated mother terrified for her only child's life. She looked significantly more inconvenienced by the disruption to her schedule than heartbroken. Arthur sat slumped in an uncomfortable molded plastic chair, his head buried deep in his trembling hands. His tailored Italian suit was severely wrinkled, and his broad shoulders shook slightly under the bright hospital lights. A few feet away, leaning casually against a vending machine with a cup of black coffee in his hand, was Julian. He had practically invited himself, smoothly claiming that the company needed to offer absolute operational support to the executive family during this crisis. Before I could approach them, the heavy double doors of the trauma bay swung open. A visibly exhausted attending trauma surgeon stepped out into the quiet waiting area. He wore blue surgical scrubs that were stained with dark, terrifying spots of fresh blood. He pulled his surgical mask down around his neck, revealing a deeply lined, physically drained face. "Family of Leo Caldwell?" he called out, his authoritative voice echoing down the sterile corridor. We rushed forward, forming a tight, anxious circle around the medical professional. "He is medically stable for the moment," the surgeon said, holding up a thick metal clipboard and clicking his pen. "We managed to successfully stop the primary hemorrhaging in his upper left thigh, and his vital signs are currently holding steady on the monitors. However, the internal trauma from the steering wheel impact caused his overall hemoglobin levels to drop to a critically low point. We need to administer a massive blood transfusion immediately to prevent him from slipping into severe, irreversible hypovolemic shock. Arthur let out a loud, shuddering breath of profound relief, leaning heavily against the painted drywall for physical support. "Then do it immediately," Isabella demanded, waving her manicured hand dismissively at the tired doctor. "Give him whatever blood he needs, patch him up quickly, and get him moved into a private VIP recovery suite. We don't have all day to stand around in this depressing hallway." The doctor frowned deeply, clearly unimpressed by Isabella's highly demanding, inherently arrogant attitude. "It is not that simple, ma'am," he said, his professional tone growing noticeably firm and uncompromising. "Your son has a very rare and specific blood type. He is AB negative positive. Under normal, everyday circumstances, this wouldn't be a massive logistical issue, but our hospital's blood bank experienced an unprecedented shortage this week due to a massive multi-car pileup on the interstate. We simply do not have enough AB positive or universal O negative blood in our immediate inventory to safely complete the required transfusion." He looked directly at Arthur, then shifted his serious, urgent gaze to Isabella. "We need direct family donors right now. The boy desperately needs blood, and he needs it flowing into his veins within the next hour to survive. We can bring you both into the lab and cross-match you immediately." The world around me seemed to halt completely. The low mechanical hum of the hospital ventilation system faded entirely away. The distant rhythmic beeping of the cardiac monitors went dead in my ringing ears. The attending doctor's specific clinical words echoed loudly in my mind, repeating over and over again like a broken, skipping record. A B positive. The boy is a B positive. Boy is... My mind, rigorously trained over decades to analyze complex financial data and detect absolute factual inconsistencies, immediately latched onto a monumental, undeniable biological impossibility. I am an O blood type. My beloved late husband, Richard, was an O blood type. By the absolute, unbreakable scientific laws of Mendelian genetics, two biological parents with type O blood can only ever produce children with type O blood. Therefore, my biological son, Arthur, was undeniably, factually, an O blood type. I knew this for an absolute fact. I vividly remembered the medical paperwork from his severe childhood appendectomy. Isabella, I knew from a brief conversation years ago regarding a luxury holistic diet plan she was strictly following, was an A blood type. I stood perfectly still in the sterile hospital corridor, staring blankly at the white wall directly behind the doctor. Basic high school biology began to scream, blaring massive, deafening alarms deep inside my head. An O blood type parent and an A blood type parent can naturally produce an A blood type child. They can occasionally produce an O blood type child, but they cannot, under any conceivable scientific circumstance, ever produce an AB positive child. The dominant B allele had to come from somewhere. It had to come directly from a biological father who actively carried the B genetic trait. Arthur absolutely did not carry it. I absolutely did not carry it. Richard absolutely did not carry it. There was only one impossible, horrifying, devastating conclusion staring me right in the face in that bright hallway. The teenage boy bleeding out on the surgical operating table. The boy I had spoiled, loved, and rigorously prepared to inherit my massive luxury hotel empire, did not have a single, solitary drop of Caldwell blood running through his veins. Leo was not my biological grandson. I slowly turned my heavy head to look at Isabella. She was frantically arguing with the tired doctor, loudly demanding he call another private hospital to fly the necessary blood in by an emergency helicopter. She was putting on a loud, incredibly aggressive performance to deliberately distract from the obvious, urgent request for her to donate her own blood. She knew she couldn't donate. She knew the cross-match would immediately expose her 19-year-old lie. Then, I turned my cold, calculating gaze directly to my son. I fully expected to see a man confused by basic genetics. I fully expected to see a worried, grieving father desperately questioning the doctor about a potential catastrophic laboratory error. Instead, What I saw chilled me to the absolute bone and shattered my maternal heart into 1,000 jagged pieces. Arthur was backed firmly against the painted hospital wall, gripping the metal handrail with bone-white knuckles. He was not looking at the frustrated doctor. He was not looking at his screaming wife. He was staring firmly and intensely at the linoleum floor, his entire body trembling violently under his expensive suit. He was sweating profusely, heavy beads of moisture rolling down his pale forehead. He was not confused by the science. He was utterly terrified. He knew. He absolutely, undeniably knew the genetic math did not add up. When he finally found the courage to lift his heavy head, he felt my intense eyes burning right into him. For one brief, absolutely terrifying second, our eyes met across the sterile corridor. He saw the cold, sharp realization settling permanently over my face. He saw that I had done the genetic math in my head. Arthur immediately broke eye contact, looking away entirely, completely unable to face the mother he was actively helping to destroy. Julian stepped forward, placing a reassuring, deeply familiar hand on Isabella's lower back, and smoothly offered to use his corporate connections to secure a private helicopter transport for the blood from a neighboring state. I waited until Julian had stepped away to make the calls. I waited until the doctor retreated to the trauma bay. The suffocating tension in the hallway was palpable. I looked at my son, and with a voice that was incredibly calm, measured, and entirely free of accusation, I set the trap. "Arthur," I said softly, stepping closer to him, leaning heavily on my cane. "I am a little confused by the medical details. The doctor was very clear that Leo is an AB positive blood type, but Richard and I were both O blood types. You are an O. Isabella is an A. How exactly does a boy with those biological parents end up with AB positive blood?" Arthur flinched physically, exactly as if I had reached out and stabbed him in the ribs. The nervous sweat on his forehead instantly returned in a flood. He did not give me a puzzled look. He did not express genuine confusion. Instead, he reacted with immediate, explosive, and deeply defensive hostility. "Are you completely out of your mind?" he snapped, his face flushing a deep, angry crimson. He stepped aggressively toward me, his voice cracking with high-pitched, desperate anger. "My son is lying in a hospital bed, bleeding to death, and you are trying to turn a simple, stupid clerical mistake into one of your paranoid, senile delusions?" "Arthur, I am simply asking a logical—" "There is absolutely no logic left in your rotting brain," Isabella hissed, stepping right into my personal space. She glared down at me, her eyes filled with absolute, unadulterated malice. "This is exactly what Dr. Evans warned us about. Your mind is completely broken, Eleanor. You are making up insane, psychotic conspiracy theories because your brain is misfiring. You are a sick, demented old woman who can't even remember what she had for breakfast, let alone high school biology." Arthur pointed a shaking finger right at my face. "Do not do this today, Mother. Do not start your crazy interrogations. The laboratory made a typo on his chart. It happens all the time. But you wouldn't understand that because your mind is fading away. You are an absolute embarrassment to this family." The sheer, venomous audacity of their gaslighting hit me like a physical blow. They were actively weaponizing my supposed dementia to cover up a massive biological fraud. They were screaming in my face, calling me insane, trying to bully, intimidate, and humiliate me into doubting my own flawless intellect. The spring inside my chest was compressing with terrifying, agonizing force. I looked at their furious, sweating faces. I forced my shoulders to slump. I let my hands begin to tremble violently on the silver handle of my cane. I widened my eyes, filling them with fake, pathetic tears of deep confusion and profound fear. I'm so sorry," I whimpered, taking a shaky step back, shrinking away from them. I pressed a hand to my forehead, acting entirely overwhelmed and disoriented. "You're right. My mind, it's just so confusing. I don't know what I thought. Please, forgive me, Arthur. I am just a confused, tired old woman." Isabella let out a harsh, mocking scoff, crossing her arms over her chest, utterly victorious. "Exactly. Now go sit down in the corner and stay out of our way before you give yourself another stroke. We will be finalizing the conservatorship papers tomorrow morning. It is completely obvious you cannot be trusted to make a single rational decision anymore." I nodded weakly, shuffling away from them like a defeated, broken ghost. They looked at me and saw absolute flawless victory. But behind my trembling hands, my mind was entirely lethal. They had just handed me the final piece of the puzzle. I retreated to the dimmest, most sterile corner of the hospital waiting room, collapsing into a molded plastic chair. I buried my face deep into my trembling hands, a picture of absolute tragic defeat. But through the narrow, shadowed gaps between my fingers, my eyes were entirely dry, unblinking, and lethally observant. I watched them. The performance of my supposed cognitive collapse had worked flawlessly. The suffocating, terrifying tension that had gripped Arthur just moments ago had completely evaporated. He slumped back into his chair, wiping a sheen of cold sweat from his pale forehead, letting out a long, ragged exhale. He had survived the genetic scare. He firmly believed his mother was too far gone, her brain too rotten, to piece the catastrophic biological puzzle together. Isabella leaned against the pale hospital wall, running a perfectly manicured hand through her styled hair. She shot a highly significant, deeply unguarded look toward Julian, who was returning from the phone booths. I watched Julian's eyes catch hers. It was a micro-expression, a lingering, intensely intimate gaze of shared survival and victorious conspiracy that had absolutely no business existing between a chief operating officer and his boss's wife. In that single, fleeting glance, the sickening 19-year-old truth was physically confirmed before my very eyes. Isabella pushed off the wall and walked over to the corner where I was huddled. She didn't kneel to meet my eye level. She stood towering over me, intentionally casting a long, oppressive shadow across my trembling frame. "Eleanor," she said. Her voice dropped the screaming hysteria from moments ago, settling into a sickening, honey-coated condescension usually reserved for a deeply confused, irritating toddler. She reached out and patted the top of my head. The physical contact was repulsive, her cold, heavily ringed fingers pressing against my gray hair in a profound display of absolute, calculated disrespect. "Julian has secured the helicopter. Leo is going to be perfectly fine, but this environment is far too stressful for your fragile, fading condition. You look completely drained. You are going home now." I slowly lowered my hands, looking up at her with wide, vacant, incredibly lost eyes. "But, Leo, I should stay for my grandson. I need to be here." "No, Mother," Arthur interjected, stepping up beside his wife, suddenly emboldened by my apparent, pathetic submission. He shoved his hands into his pockets, looking down at me with an expression that bordered on disgust. "You are just getting in the way here. The doctors need space, and frankly, Isabella and I don't have the mental energy to manage your delusional episodes while dealing with a real medical crisis. Marcus has the Maybach waiting at the front entrance. Go home. Take your sedatives, sleep." Isabella leaned in closer, the overpowering artificial scent of her expensive French perfume practically suffocating me, masking the smell of hospital bleach. "And Eleanor, do not forget, the board members and the corporate legal team will be at the penthouse tomorrow at exactly 10 a.m. to finalize the conservatorship. Have your maid dress you in something presentable. We wouldn't want the board to see how truly pathetic and lost you've become before you sign the papers. Be a good girl tomorrow." The absolute breathtaking audacity of her gaslighting, the vicious, calculated humiliation delivered right in the middle of a public hospital ward, was a masterclass in psychological torture. They were stripping away my humanity layer by agonizing layer, confident that I was too weak, too old, and too mentally shattered to ever strike back. The spring inside my chest compressed to its absolute agonizing maximum limit. I did not glare at her. I did not bare my teeth. I let the indignity wash over me, absorbing every ounce of their venom to fuel my impending war. "Yes, Isabella," I whispered, my voice a hollow, defeated rasp. "Tomorrow at 10, I will be ready." I stood up slowly, leaning heavily on my silver-handled walking cane, and shuffled toward the exit. I allowed my shoulders to slump entirely, playing the tragic role of the deposed queen walking willingly toward her own exile. I could feel their arrogant, mocking eyes burning into my back as I walked away, but I did not turn around. The moment the heavy glass doors of the hospital slid shut behind me, the cold, biting Boston wind hit my face, and the fragile, trembling, senile old woman completely ceased to exist. I straightened my spine, my posture instantly snapping into rigid, unyielding steel. The fake tremor in my hands vanished without a trace, replaced by the lethal, rock-solid stability of a seasoned corporate predator. I slid into the back of my Maybach, the heavy door thudding shut, sealing me in absolute privacy. "Take me to the Caldwell Heritage Hotel, Marcus," I instructed my chauffeur. My voice was sharp, commanding, and entirely devoid of the pathetic weakness I had weaponized upstairs. "Use the private underground executive entrance. We have work to do." I didn't have the luxury of time to mourn the illusion of my family. I had exactly 24 hours until they attempted to legally bury me alive, and I needed the undeniable biological ammunition to execute them first. The hotel was quiet when I slipped through the private access elevator. I bypassed the grand, opulent lobby and headed straight for the top floors. My first target was the executive VIP fitness center. Julian was a creature of immense vanity and absolute predictable routine. He kept a private, permanently reserved locker in the VIP changing room, frequently leaving his workout gear for the hotel laundry staff to manage. I used my master physical key card, the original override key that Julian's digital lockout could not possibly touch, to access the locker room. It smelled of eucalyptus and expensive men's cologne. I opened locker 01. Sitting right on top of his leather gym bag was a damp silk workout towel he had used that very morning before rushing to my house to stage his intervention. I pulled a sterile plastic evidence bag from my designer purse, picked up the towel with a pair of silver tweezers, and dropped it carefully inside, sealing the biological material tight. Half the battle was won. Now I needed the final nail for their coffins. I took the elevator up to the residential penthouse suites. Leo, the boy I had mistakenly believed to be my grandson for 18 years, occupied the largest suite on the east wing. I let myself into his room. It was a chaotic, disrespectful mess of expensive video game consoles, limited edition designer sneakers, and scattered clothes, a monument to the spoiled, entitled life I had entirely funded. I walked directly into his lavish, gold-accented marble bathroom. Resting in a silver tray on the vanity was his personalized, monogrammed silver hairbrush. I held the brush up to the harsh vanity lights. Woven deep into the bristles were 3 distinct strands of dark hair, the tiny, whitish root follicles still perfectly intact. It was a goldmine of undeniable genetic material. I plucked them out, dropped them into a second sterile bag, and slipped both pieces of evidence into the inner breast pocket of my Chanel suit, right next to my steadily beating heart. I left the hotel as silently as a ghost, my heartbeat a steady, rhythmic drum of impending vengeance. When I finally returned to my Beacon Hill estate, the house was dark, empty, and agonizingly silent. But I did not go to my bedroom to take the sedatives Arthur had so cruelly suggested. I walked straight into my grand oak-paneled library. I locked the heavy double doors from the inside and pulled the thick velvet curtains shut, plunging the room into absolute secrecy. I approached the massive antique oil painting of Richard that hung above the grand fireplace. I pressed a hidden latch on the ornate wooden frame. The painting swung open smoothly, revealing a state-of-the-art biometric wall safe. I pressed my thumb against the scanner. A soft green light blinked, and the heavy steel door clicked open with a satisfying thud. Julian thought he had successfully blinded me by locking me out of the digital corporate network. He vastly underestimated the paranoia and meticulous preparation of a woman who built her fortune in the gritty, ruthless hospitality wars of the 1980s. Inside the safe sat a thick, heavy, leather-bound book, The Shadow Ledger. It was a completely offline, manually updated physical record of every single massive financial transaction moving through Caldwell Heritage, maintained weekly by a fiercely loyal, heavily compensated private accountant who answered only to me. I carried the heavy ledger to my mahogany desk, turned on the brass reading lamp, and opened a secure burner phone I kept locked in the bottom drawer. I dialed a number I hadn't used in 5 years. "Victor," I said, the moment my attorney answered the line. My voice was sharp, cold, and entirely devoid of emotion. "Cancel everything you have for the next 24 hours. I need you at my estate immediately. Bring the premier genetic testing lab's emergency contact and call Robert Sanchez. I need the best private investigator in Boston running a deep dive background trace on Isabella and Julian dating back exactly 20 years. Leave no stone unturned. There was a brief pause on the line. Victor Lang was a shark, and he instantly smelled blood in the water. Who are the targets, Eleanor? My son, my daughter-in-law, and my COO, I replied, staring at the cold, hard numbers in the ledger, already spotting the horrific, glaring inconsistencies hidden beneath Julian's fake shell companies. They are attempting a hostile takeover tomorrow morning at 10, disguised as a medical conservatorship. And Victor, they think I'm senile. They think I'm completely broken. Victor chuckled, a low, dry, terrifying sound that promised absolute legal destruction. Then we will let them walk right into the slaughterhouse, Eleanor. For the next 12 hours, my library transformed into a heavily encrypted war room. Victor expedited the genetic samples through a private, highly confidential laboratory utilizing a premium emergency fee. Sanchez, the private investigator, began systematically tearing apart the digital, romantic, and financial histories of Isabella and Julian. By dawn, the psychological torture from my family resumed. My smartphone buzzed on the desk. It was a text from Isabella. The board is arriving in 3 hours. Make sure you take your medication, Eleanor. Do not embarrass Arthur today by having one of your episodes. Be compliant, sign the papers, and this will all be over smoothly. I stared at the glowing screen. The sheer, intoxicating arrogance of her words was astounding. She truly believed she was speaking to a defeated, helpless prisoner. She was gaslighting a woman who was currently holding the match that would burn her entire existence to the ground. I picked up the phone. I deliberately made my voice sound incredibly weak, raspy, and thoroughly exhausted as I left her a voicemail. I understand, Isabella, I whispered into the receiver, letting out a pathetic, shaky sigh. I took my pills. I'm so tired. I won't fight you anymore. I just want this to be over. I hung up the phone and smiled. It was a smile devoid of any warmth, a chilling, predatory baring of teeth in the quiet, shadowed library. The spring was fully compressed. The trap was meticulously set, and my arrogant enemies were blindly marching their king directly onto my killing floor. The day of absolute reckoning arrived with the cold, sterile, and unforgiving light of a Boston winter morning. At exactly 9:55 a.m., I stood outside the massive, heavy mahogany double doors of the Caldwell Heritage Penthouse Boardroom. For the past 3 agonizing days, I had flawlessly played the role of a fading, broken, senile ghost. I had allowed them to humiliate me, gaslight me, and systematically strip away my dignity in my own home. The psychological spring inside my chest had been compressed so tightly, with such violent force, that it physically burned my ribs. Now, the trap was meticulously set. The federal snare was drawn tight. It was time to let the spring snap. I pushed the heavy doors open and shuffled into the expansive room, leaning heavily on my silver-handled cane. The space was packed to the brim. Isabella had eagerly orchestrated a grand, highly theatrical audience for her ultimate moment of triumph. She sat squarely at the very head of the long, polished conference table, occupying the exact leather executive chair that had belonged to my late husband, and then to me. To her right sat Arthur, looking incredibly pale, sweating profusely through his custom navy suit, his eyes darting nervously around the room. To her left sat Julian, his posture radiating an absolute, unchecked, and sickening arrogance. The rest of the table was lined with the executive board members, mostly sycophantic, grossly underqualified lackeys Julian had recently promoted to serve as compliant rubber stamps for their hostile takeover. They looked at me as I entered, their faces a nauseating mixture of forced, fake pity and smug, triumphant dismissal. They fully believed they were about to witness the pathetic, final surrender of a mad, senile old queen. I walked slowly, letting my hands tremble visibly, and took the single empty chair at the far opposite end of the massive table. The room fell completely silent, save for the faint, mournful howling of the winter wind against the floor-to-ceiling glass. Isabella leaned forward, interlacing her flawlessly manicured fingers. She was practically vibrating with greedy, unadulterated triumph. She motioned to one of Julian's lackeys, who quickly slid a thick, heavy manila folder down the length of the table. It came to a gentle stop directly in front of me. Sitting right on top of the legal paperwork was the heavy, gleaming gold Montblanc pen. "This is the final medical conservatorship and asset transfer agreement," Isabella stated. Her voice echoed loudly in the quiet boardroom. The fake, sugary sympathy she had used in the hospital was entirely gone. Her tone was sharp, commanding, and dripping with raw venom. "The transition of executive power has already been unanimously approved by the board members present here today. We have streamlined the legal process to save time. All we need right now, Eleanor, is your final signature on the bottom line." I looked down at the thick stack of papers. Buried deep within those pages was a meticulously crafted indemnification clause that would legally frame me for the $4.5 million Julian and Isabella had embezzled from the employee pension fund. They intended to use my fabricated dementia to bury their massive criminal enterprise entirely under my name, leaving me to face federal prison or a psychiatric ward while they bought villas in Europe. Isabella leaned back in my chair, a cruel, mocking smile spreading slowly across her perfectly made-up face. "You are completely done here, Eleanor. Your mind is broken. Sign the papers, let Arthur and me protect the legacy, and quietly accept your retirement in the Vermont Psychiatric Facility. Do not make this a public embarrassment. You don't have the mental capacity to fight us." The sheer, brutal audacity of her words hung heavily in the stagnant air. Julian chuckled softly, a deeply insulting sound, adjusting his silk tie. Arthur kept his eyes glued to the table, too cowardly to even watch his mother's execution. I did not react. I kept my face an impenetrable mask of frail confusion. I slowly reached out with a violently trembling hand and picked up the heavy gold pen. I held it loosely, letting the bright morning light catch the golden barrel. I looked directly down the table at Arthur. I gave him one final, silent plea, one fleeting, microscopic opportunity to be a man, to speak up, to stop this madness before the federal hammer came crashing down and obliterated his entire existence. Arthur swallowed hard. His Adam's apple bobbed. He saw the profound question in my eyes, and he actively chose his pathetic path. He completely broke eye contact, staring blindly at his expensive shoes. The betrayal was absolute. The final tether of my maternal mercy was cleanly severed. I slowly opened my fingers. The gold pen dropped from my hand, hitting the polished mahogany table with a sharp, echoing clack. I did not pick it up. I simply stopped shaking. The violent tremor in my hands vanished instantly, entirely eradicated. I straightened my spine, abandoning the hunched, defeated posture of the fading widow. I placed both of my hands flat and perfectly steady on the polished wood. I looked down the length of the table, my eyes locking onto Isabella with the lethal, unblinking, terrifying focus of an apex predator that had just locked the cage doors from the inside. "You told me my mind was rapidly deteriorating, Isabella," I said. My voice was no longer a weak, raspy, pitiful whisper. It was a booming, resonant, thunderous command that cracked through the room like a whip. "You said I was hallucinating. You said I dropped that antique teacup because my brain was severely damaged from a stroke." Isabella's cruel smirk faltered. A microscopic flicker of profound confusion crossed her face as the frail old woman before her suddenly transformed into a titan of industry. "I did not drop that teacup because of a stroke," I continued, my words measured, razor sharp, and terrifyingly cold. "I dropped it to see if any of you possessed a single solitary shred of basic human decency. You failed. And as for my memory, it is absolutely flawless. In fact, it is sharp enough to remember the fundamental, unbreakable laws of high school biology." Before Isabella could even open her mouth to respond, before her brain could process the looming threat, the heavy, soundproof double doors of the boardroom violently swung wide open. Victor Lang strode inside, flanked by two towering, stern-faced federal agents wearing dark windbreakers with the golden letters FBI printed boldly across their backs. The room's temperature instantly plummeted to an absolute freezing cold. The arrogant, triumphant smiles plastered across the faces of the executive board members vanished, replaced by a thick, suffocating wave of collective terror. Victor marched directly toward the head of the table, stopping just a few feet away from where Isabella sat frozen in my leather chair. He unclasped his sleek black briefcase, the sharp metallic snap slicing through the absolute silence. He reached inside and pulled out the thick, tamper-proof envelope containing the verified genetic laboratory report. With a smooth, practiced flick of his wrist, he tossed the crucial document onto the exact center of the table. It slid smoothly over the polished wood, coming to a sudden halt directly between Isabella and Arthur. "I am legally representing Eleanor Caldwell," Victor announced loudly, staring coldly down at Isabella. "The sealed document I have just placed before you is a legally binding, independently verified genetic analysis expedited 48 hours ago. The biological samples analyzed yield a probability of paternity of exactly 0%. The subject, currently known as Leo Caldwell, is definitively and permanently excluded as the biological offspring of Arthur Caldwell Jr. The heavy words hit the stagnant air like a physical shockwave. A profound, horrified gasp echoed from the board members. Isabella's arrogant, beautifully constructed smirk violently shattered into a hideous, grotesque mask of pure, undeniable panic. All the blood drained entirely from her face, leaving her skin a sickly, translucent, ghostly white. The confident predator who had just seconds ago ordered me into an insane asylum was instantly replaced by a cornered, hyperventilating animal. Her mouth opened and closed silently, her perfectly manicured hands trembling violently as they hovered uselessly over the stark white envelope. She was staring at the absolute destruction of her 19-year-old lie. Julian suddenly felt the crushing, suffocating weight of his reality. His smug grin was completely wiped from his sweating face. Recognizing the federal agents, his deep financial knowledge told him exactly what was happening. He placed his sweating hands on the table and desperately attempted to push his heavy chair backward, instinctively trying to flee the room to scrub the corporate servers. He barely made it halfway to his feet before one of the towering federal agents moved with absolutely terrifying speed. The agent slammed a massive, incredibly heavy hand firmly down onto Julian's shoulder, forcing the corrupt COO aggressively and painfully back into his seat. "Do not attempt to stand up, sir," the agent commanded sternly, his voice a low, dangerous growl. I stood up from my chair at the far end of the table. The entire room watched me in stunned, paralyzed silence as I walked slowly, purposefully, down the length of the room. The rhythmic tapping of my cane was the only sound. I stopped directly behind Arthur's chair. I reached into my designer purse and pulled out the printed email Sanchez had recovered from the deleted archives, an email date stamped exactly 10 years ago. I threw the crisp paper directly onto Arthur's lap. "Do not dare play the victim today, Arthur," I said, my voice dropping into a deadly, gravelly whisper that carried to every corner of the room. "You knew you were completely sterile from the mumps you had as a child. You have known for 10 long years. You actively conspired with your treacherous wife to raise another man's son because you were absolutely terrified that the Caldwell bloodline clause would strip you of your unearned luxury. You sold your own mother's legacy for a monthly paycheck." Arthur looked down at his own email address printed on the page. His knees completely gave out beneath the table. He slumped forward, burying his face in his trembling hands, and began to weep, ugly, visceral, pathetic, high-pitched sobs. "Mother, please," he choked out, snot and tears running down his pale face. "She made me do it. I was terrified you would cut me off. I have nothing else." "And you, Julian," I said, turning my merciless gaze to the man pinned firmly to his chair. I pulled the heavy printout of the shadow ledger from my purse and tossed it violently onto the table right in front of him. "You told me yesterday that you were temporarily suspending my network access to protect the company's assets from my unfortunate memory lapses. It seems my memory is perfectly intact. I remembered exactly where you hid the $4.5 million you systematically drained from the employee pension fund using those 4 fake LLCs registered in Delaware. Your access, Julian, is permanently suspended. The unholy alliance they had so carefully constructed over 15 years rapidly crumbled into a venomous, pathetic, screaming match. Arthur was sobbing uncontrollably, begging for mercy. Isabella hysterically pointed her shaking finger at Julian, screaming at the top of her lungs that he was the mastermind, that he had forced her into the embezzlement. Julian snarled back like a rabid dog, his face purple with rage, cursing her boundless greed and calling her a manipulative parasite. They were cornered rats, viciously tearing each other to absolute pieces as the ship sank around them. I watched their total, magnificent destruction with absolute, unblinking detachment. My heart was a frozen, impenetrable vault. They had vastly underestimated the profound, dangerous resilience of a woman who had actually scrubbed floors and bled to build the ground they were currently standing on. I gave Victor a single, definitive nod. The federal agents stepped forward, the heavy steel of their handcuffs gleaming brightly in the morning light. "Isabella Caldwell, Julian Vance," the lead agent announced, his commanding voice slicing through the chaotic screaming. "You are under arrest for federal wire fraud and the criminal embezzlement of $4.5 million. You have the right to remain silent." The harsh, metallic clicking of the heavy steel handcuffs ratcheting closed around Isabella's wrists echoed with sharp, absolute finality. She did not surrender quietly. She began to thrash violently, her tailored red suit twisting and tearing as she kicked her expensive stilettos wildly against the marble floor, completely losing her mind. "You cannot do this to me!" she shrieked, her voice shrill, piercing, and utterly desperate. "I gave you the illusion of a perfect family. You were nothing without me. My mind isn't broken. Yours is. You owe me, Eleanor. You owe me everything." I leaned over the table, looking directly into her wild, terrified eyes. I used the exact weapon she had used to humiliate me just days ago. "Take her away, officers," I said coldly, my voice dripping with artificial, sugary pity. "She is clearly hallucinating. It must be a severe cognitive decline. She is becoming a hazard to herself." The agents dragged the screaming, flailing Isabella and the utterly defeated, silent Julian out of the double doors. The heavy mahogany slammed shut, cutting off her fading shrieks. The treacherous board members scrambled out the side doors in absolute terror, clutching their briefcases, desperate to escape the blast radius. I turned my attention back to my weeping son. Victor handed me a single sheet of thick, embossed legal paper. I dropped the legally binding eviction and disinheritance notice directly onto Arthur's lap. "You have exactly 1 hour to clear your personal belongings out of the Beacon Hill estate," I stated, my tone as unforgiving as solid granite. "You are stripped of your corporate title, your salary, and you are permanently, irrevocably disinherited. You sold my legacy. Get out of my building, Arthur, and never ever call me mother again." 6 months have gracefully, quietly passed since that brutal winter storm tore through the penthouse boardroom of the Caldwell Heritage Hotel. Today, the biting, unforgiving Boston chill has completely surrendered to the gentle, blooming, golden warmth of late spring. I am sitting in the private glass conservatory of my Beacon Hill estate, surrounded by Richard's vibrant, thriving collection of exotic orchids. The morning sunlight streams through the pristine glass panes, casting a warm, luminous glow over the emerald green velvet sofa where my traitorous family once sat to plan my demise. I reach out and lift my delicate bone china teacup, taking a slow, profoundly peaceful sip of Earl Grey tea. It is the exact same Royal Doulton teacup I intentionally shattered on the marble floor half a year ago. I did not throw the broken pieces away. Instead, I hired a master artisan to painstakingly repair it using the ancient Japanese art of kintsugi, mending the shattered porcelain with thick, intricate seams of pure liquid gold. It sits in my hands right now, heavier, far more beautiful, and infinitely stronger specifically because it was broken. It is the absolute perfect metaphor for my life, my mind, and my empire. The relentless, grinding wheels of the federal justice system moved with an agonizingly slow but ultimately devastating, inescapable certainty. I sat quietly in the heavy oak pews of the federal courthouse last month, watching the final chapter of Isabella and Julian's monumental arrogance come to a decisive and permanent end. The presiding judge, a stern, unyielding woman with absolutely zero tolerance for white-collar corporate predators, delivered a blistering, humiliating reprimand that echoed loudly through the silent, packed courtroom. Isabella and Julian were both sentenced to 15 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary for massive wire fraud, conspiracy, and the grand embezzlement of pension funds. Isabella did not scream, thrash, or threaten anyone this time. The terrifying reality of her situation had finally crushed her delusions of grandeur. She stood completely frozen before the judge, her once flawless designer wardrobe replaced by the stark, humiliating, deeply unflattering reality of a standard-issue khaki prison uniform. The luxurious, pampered, elite life she had spent nearly 2 decades lying and maliciously manipulating to secure had violently evaporated into thin air. Julian stood beside her, a hollow, defeated, rapidly aging shell of the slick executive he used to be. They were marched out of the courtroom in heavy iron chains, permanently exiled from the opulent world they had tried to steal from me. My biological son Arthur faced a very different yet equally crushing kind of prison. Completely cut off from the vast Caldwell wealth and abruptly, permanently stripped of the lavish lifestyle he had grown so incredibly accustomed to, he experienced a brutal, unforgiving crash into the concrete pavement of reality. I hired a private investigator to check on him exactly once, simply to ensure the legal eviction had been fully executed. Arthur is currently living in a cramped, noisy, poorly heated apartment complex on the far less desirable outskirts of the city. He spends his days working as a valet at a rival boutique hotel downtown. The boy who once wore custom Italian suits and planned to inherit millions now wears a cheap polyester uniform, parking the expensive luxury cars he used to effortlessly drive, and enduring the freezing Boston rain for meager $5 tips. He is finally being forced to learn the true, exhausting value of a hard-earned dollar, a lesson Richard and I had desperately tried to teach him decades ago. I feel absolutely no pity for his current miserable circumstances. He is simply reaping the barren, bitter harvest of the deceitful seeds he so willingly sowed. As for Leo, the arrogant 18-year-old boy who grew up believing he was the untouchable, sole heir to my empire, I did not leave him entirely destitute on the streets. He was a product of monumental deception, yes, but he was also an unwitting victim of his mother's profound, suffocating sins. I legally severed all familial ties, permanently removing his name from the Caldwell Trust, but I provided him with exactly 1 year of fully paid college tuition and a modest basic living stipend. That gave him exactly 12 months to find a part-time job, secure his own student loans, and figure out his own path forward in the real world. After those 12 months expire, the accounts will automatically close, and he will be completely on his own. While the architects of my attempted destruction faced their grim, miserable new realities, I focused all of my formidable, unyielding energy on repairing the profound damage they had inflicted upon my life's work. The recovery of Caldwell heritage was not a simple or easy task, but I approached it with the exact same relentless, driving determination that had originally allowed me to build the empire from a single, struggling bed and breakfast. My very first executive action was to personally contact the fiercely loyal senior executives and dedicated staff members who had been unceremoniously, brutally fired during Isabella and Julian's brief, arrogant reign of terror. I invited them back to the corporate headquarters, offering them their former positions, along with substantial financial bonuses and sincere, heartfelt apologies for the trauma they endured. Together, we worked tirelessly alongside the federal investigative team to trace every single stolen penny through Julian's complex labyrinth of offshore routing protocols. The $4.5 million was successfully recovered in its absolute entirety, and I personally oversaw the direct transfer of those funds back into the employee pension accounts, ensuring the futures of my staff were permanently secured. But the ultimate restoration of my company required a profound, unbreakable structural change to the very foundation of the Caldwell legacy. I needed to ensure that monumental greed and unearned entitlement could never again threaten the magnificent empire I sacrificed my youth to create. I executed a brand new, legally impenetrable trust agreement. 50% of my entire personal wealth and corporate holdings were instantly transferred into the newly established Richard and Eleanor Caldwell Foundation, a massive philanthropic initiative explicitly designed to provide unrestricted grants and full university scholarships to single mothers and brilliant, underprivileged women starting their own businesses. The remaining 50% of the entire company was irrevocably placed into an employee stock ownership program. The immense, sprawling wealth of Caldwell heritage will never be handed down to an entitled, ungrateful, lazy heir. It is now systematically distributed among the dedicated housekeepers, the exhausted concierges, the diligent bellhops, and the loyal executives who actually scrubbed the floors and bled to build this place alongside me. They are the true family of this empire. This evening, as the sun begins to set, I stand completely alone on the expansive rooftop balcony of the Caldwell Heritage Hotel, looking out over the endless, glittering Boston skyline. The cool evening breeze whips at my tailored Chanel suit, but I feel a deep, radiating, profound warmth blooming steadily within my chest. I reach deep into my pocket and pull out a heavy, tarnished brass key, the original physical key to the very first room Richard and I ever rented out 30 years ago. I am a widow. I am solitary. But looking out at the magnificent, illuminated empire I successfully protected, I have never felt more incredibly, undeniably free. They say that blood is thicker than water, but life has a funny, often brutal way of teaching you the hardest truths. Blood makes you related, but loyalty and respect make you family. I spent years pouring my heart, my soul, and my hard-earned wealth into people who only looked at me and saw an obstacle to their own boundless greed. But the exact moment I stopped being the tragic victim they so desperately wanted, I became the queen they feared. What about you? What would you do if the people you trusted the most, the people you shared your home, your wealth, and your heart with, turned against you in your darkest, most vulnerable hour? Have you ever had to draw a hard, unforgiving line and cut a toxic family member completely out of your life to protect your own peace, your legacy, and your sanity? Let me know your story in the comments below. I read every single one, and I know how hard it is to take that first step toward freedom. If you found satisfaction in this story of absolute justice and old money revenge, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a story of karma finally collecting its debts. Until next time, stay strong, always trust your instincts, and never let anyone steal your crown.
Huyết thống có thể mang đến cho chúng ta những người cùng họ hàng, cùng chung dòng máu hay một cái tên trong gia phả. Nhưng một gia đình thực sự, một tổ ấm đúng nghĩa, phải được xây dựng và gắn kết từ lòng trung thành, sự thấu hiểu và tôn trọng lẫn nhau. Thiếu đi những giá trị cốt lõi đó, mối quan hệ ruột thịt chỉ còn là lớp vỏ bọc danh nghĩa lạnh lẽo. Khi lòng vị tha bị xem nhẹ và ranh giới cuối cùng bị vượt qua bởi sự phản bội, sự nhẫn nhịn, đó sẽ chuyển hóa thành sức mạnh lý trí đầy quyết đoán. Khi đối mặt với sự phản bội từ chính những người gọi là người thân thuộc, việc kéo dài mối quan hệ độc hại chỉ làm bào mòn giá trị của bản thân. Do đó hãy dũng cảm cầm kéo cắt bỏ đi những mối quan hệ mang tính hủy hoại đó. Việc tách mình ra khỏi những kẻ độc hại không phải là sự tàn nhẫn, mà là hành động tự vệ cần thiết để bảo vệ đi di sản tinh thần, gìn giữ gia phong và sự tôn nghiêm tối thượng của bản thân cũng như gia đình. Sức mạnh đích thực nằm ở chỗ biết buông bỏ đúng lúc để bảo tồn những giá trị thiêng liêng nhất.